It's great to be here at Reed. It's the first time I've spent time at Reed. I've had a chance this afternoon and early this evening to spend some time with students and faculty, and there's just a tremendous spirit. It's wonderful to see the growth of the environmental studies program that's happening here and the devotion and thought that's going into it with students and faculty. And it's always wonderful to come to Portland, which has been such a leader globally in thinking about sustainability and thinking about climate and thinking about how we can live together better on this planet. I'm going to speak for a bit, maybe 30 minutes, and then have time for as many questions as folks have about any topic, whether we've talked about it or not. I'm going to talk about the coal export and oil, crude by rail issue that's brewing fast in this region and elsewhere. I'm going to do that in the context partially of reflecting back on the fight in this region to protect the old-growth forests, how that fight unfolded and what it might mean for us as we think about issues today. Before I do that, it would be helpful to me just to know how many of you are students here? And how many of you who are here tonight have lived for many, many years here in the Pacific Northwest? And how many of you are proud of the leadership role that this region, this city, this state, and this region have played in retiring coal-burning power plants and setting a model for other regions and other parts of the world for addressing climate change? Thank you. I am too. So this Sunday, the Seattle Times published a comprehensive report on the burgeoning development of coal and oil transportation in the region. And it said, to quote, "The energy industry is transforming the Pacific Northwest into a fossil fuel gateway." So what does that mean for you here in the Northwest? What does that mean for the planet? To me, a gateway means a concentration of rail, shipping, terminals, refineries, and other processing and burning of coal and oil. We'll get into a few of the details of what's going on in a few minutes, but basically I think that means millions of tons of coal and millions of barrels of oil from the inland areas of this continent where the coal is in the ground and being mined and where the oil is underground and being pumped, is shipped here by rail and by pipeline over treacherous mountains, along rivers, and through large cities and small communities. It's shipped to industrial plants where it will be refined and processed. It's shipped to terminals where it will be loaded onto ships, where it will be burned in markets near and far. So if you close your eyes for a minute and think about what does a fossil fuel gateway mean, just do that. What do you think of? What landscape, what developed setting do you think of when you think of a fossil fuel gateway? I think of the concentrations of pipelines, refineries, and shipping along the Gulf Coast from Houston and New Orleans. I think about northern New Jersey and down to Philadelphia and Wilmington, Delaware. I think about the refineries and pipelines and rail lines that line Los Angeles and Long Beach harbors. These are places where North America sends its fossil fuels, its coal, oil, and gas for processing and for shipment. These are the places with severe air quality problems, where neighboring communities suffer respiratory disease and cancers. These are places routinely experiencing oil spills and explosions. These are places contributing huge amounts of carbon to the atmosphere. So we'll talk about whether fossil fuel gateway is your vision for the future of the Pacific Northwest. But to put the answer to that question into some historical perspective, I do want to reflect back on the Pacific Northwest in the 50s and 60s and then come forward. In the 1950s and 60s, the region had a resource extraction-based economy. It was primarily timber. The economy was heavily based on cutting and milling the ancient forests that characterized this region that were globally significant. The timber industry dominated the politics of the region. The federal agencies that were responsible for managing most of those lands were that's the Forest Service and the Bureau of Land Management. We're using taxpayer funds to subsidize clear cutting, and the race was on to cut the rest of the remaining ancient forests. There were very few cries in the 50s and 60s to conserve those old-growth forests or protect the wildlife that was dependent on that habitat. And what was going on in this region at the time was nothing unique. It was not any different than any other region of the country. It's appropriate perhaps that today is the day after Earth Day. It's worth remembering that the first Earth Day was celebrated in 1970. It crystallized a growing demand from the American public that the government begin to do its job in protecting the health of people and protecting the environment. This was soon after Rachel Carson had published Silent Spring and shown the world the devastating impacts of pesticides on the natural system. It was when rivers were actually burning and killer smogs were affecting our cities. And Earth Day was not the only expression of people's concern and readiness to act, of course. A citizen-led movement demanded new laws and new safeguards, new standards about the conduct of how we will manage our public resources, how we'll protect our air and water and oceans and wildlife and public lands. Those demands found responsive audiences in members of Congress of both parties, and those demands were able to win a passage of a remarkable set of environmental laws that had not been seen in the world anywhere before. The Clean Air Act, protecting the air that we breathe, the Clean Water Act to protect streams, river streams, and our drinking water, the Endangered Species Act to protect the creatures that we live with, the National Environmental Policy Act to take environmental and health concerns into account when agencies are deciding how to use their resources. And taking cues from the civil rights movement, the citizens formed advocacy groups, a whole slew of new advocacy groups with names reminiscent of the civil rights movement, the Environmental Defense Fund, the League of Conservation Voters, the Sierra Club Legal Defense Fund, which became Earth Justice later. We saw the problems evolve over the decades since those laws were passed in the 1970s, though. The laws were not self-implementing. They're not self-enforcing. The fact that we have a law doesn't mean any behavior is going to change unless it's implemented and enforced. These agencies, whether they were the long-time agencies like the Forest Service or newly created agencies like the Environmental Protection Agency, they had to implement in painstaking detail laws that left much of the implementation actually to the states. Agencies at all levels were left shorthanded with their budgets. They were underfunded to do the jobs that they've been given. The lobbying cloud of the industries they were to regulate was stronger than the cloud of the agencies to get things done. And every step of the way, citizens had to step in and fight to demand the job get done the way the Congress had designed it to be done. Fortunately, those environmental laws contained another uniquely American element. They contained provisions allowing citizens to enforce the laws in court. This is not a part of the legal system of other countries, by and large, and it was not really a part of most of the legal culture of the United States at the time. Generally, citizens were limited to going to court when they had some damage to their property, damage to their physical health, when there was a commercial dispute. But the courts these laws recognized, and then the courts adopted the idea that citizens could sue to protect wildlife, could sue to protect places that they visited and enjoyed and they appreciated the beauty of, or they studied as scientists, or they recreated in as kayakers or as hikers, that affected the air that they breathed, whether or not they could demonstrate that they were actually physically sick. So this was revolutionary, and the blossoming of citizen interest in protecting and restoring the environment led to the founding of, as I mentioned, the Sierra Club Legal Defense Fund, now Earth Justice, where I work. And Earth Justice was created specifically to use the full power of these laws to make progress when legislative log jams were not making that possible, when the lobbying clout was obstructing progress. Our tagline at Earth Justice is because the earth needs a good lawyer, and it still does. We haven't worked ourselves out of a job. We work on climate change and energy issues. We work on protecting the natural web of life, biodiversity and habitat, and we work on protecting people from pollution images. If you want to know more about Earth Justice, which I'm not going to spend much more time on, go to earthjustice.org. So let's go back for a moment to the lessons from the Ancient Forests campaign. Citizen environmental litigation rose to the task of protecting the ancient forests and helping to shape a new future for this region. The ancient forests of the Pacific Northwest are among the richest, most diverse ecosystems in North America. They're made up of very large and very old trees. They have a complex forest structure. They have the most bird families of any ecosystem in North America and the second most mammal species. There are keystone species in the forest, most notably the northern spotted owl, which are dependent upon large areas of older mature forest. They were rapidly declining and in jeopardy of actual extinction as these forests were being cut. Salmon habitat was being destroyed along the streams of the Northwest. The intensive logging began during World War II and accelerated rapidly in the 50s and 60s and 70s as machinery got more and more powerful and as the Forest Service put more and more timber out for harvest. We were close to losing all of the ancient forests, and yet the agencies responsible for protecting them were not doing the job to follow the environmental laws, to protect habitat, to manage those forests for multiple uses, not just for timber. Litigation was brought by Earth Justice in the late 1980s, representing local chapters in Portland and Seattle of the Audubon Society, as well as other regional and national organizations. Judges in Seattle and in Portland issued injunctions against continued timber harvesting until the environmental laws were complied with. They held the agencies to the jobs that Congress had written into the laws, the job of considering wildlife and habitat and ecosystem impacts when managing the forests, the job of preventing the extinction of species in jeopardy and instead beginning to provide for their restoration. Of course, these injunctions ignited a political firestorm. There were legislative battles that tried to weaken those laws. There were riders put on the agency budgets that prevented citizens from being able to sue temporarily. That led to logging without laws, as it was called at the time, but those riders were overturned and the legislative battles were won eventually because of political intervention, because it had become such a powerful issue. In fact, this was taking place at its peak during the presidential election campaign between Bill Clinton and Al Gore against the incumbent President George Herbert Walker Bush. The Clinton election in 1992 turned the tide in part. And in 1993, here in Portland, 2 months after being inaugurated, President Clinton and Vice President Gore held a Northwest Forest Summit. If you can pause and imagine 2 months after an election, taking over an administration, what do you put at the top of your list to do? Come to the Northwest to work on national forest issues. It's not really conceivable today, but that's what they did. They directed the development of an ecosystem-based national forest management plan, and it had never been done before. It led to the development of what's now called the Northwest Forest Plan that encompasses 24 million acres over 19 national forests, equal to the size of the land area of the state of Indiana. It was a defining and catalyzing moment for how we manage our public lands. And not only in this region, but nationwide. It shifted the whole orientation of the Forest Service from almost exclusively being on harvesting timber to ecosystem management that also serves conservation and ecological values. And this National Northwest Forest Plan has been copied in many other circumstances around the country. Just one example of the impact, the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest. It stretches from the Columbia River up the spine of the Cascades to Mount Rainier. In the 1980s, annually, the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest was offering 500 million board feet of timber for harvest per year. 500 million board feet of timber is 110,000 log trucks worth of logs. I didn't do the math. That would probably stretch from here to the moon. That's a lot of log trucks. After the injunctions in the early 1990s, timber sales offered by the Gifford-Pinchot dropped 90%. To 50 million board feet, and they transitioned the timber program from cutting old-growth forests to cutting thinning for fire protection and restoration of choked old second and third growth forests. Today, in many of the forests in the Northwest, outdoor recreation uses dominate. There are community and economic benefits, of course. Think about the town of Bend, Oregon. If anyone been to Bend, Oregon? Bend was dominated for most of the 20th century by two of the largest sawmills in the world. By the time we're talking about, by the 80s and 90s, those trees in the vicinity had been decimated. The sawmills had been closed and allowed to fall into ruin. But now Bend is a mecca of recreation, of retirement, of microbrewing, of those sawmills themselves. Many of those buildings have been restored. Just one example. So what's the takeaway from this story that applies to today in thinking about fossil fuels? There was already an economic trend in place. The lumber mill jobs were declining. The timber was being exhausted. The timber companies were moving to the southeast, where there's flat land and big pine plantations were being planted. But the political pressure on the agencies responsible for managing these precious resources kept them going in the old way. They were not able to, or they were not willing to consider a new path, even when it was staring them in the face that they had to, or there would be no agent forest left. It took citizens stepping in to enforce the laws that played a crucial and catalytic role in creating space for a new paradigm to take place, a new approach to be developed, to keeping the pressure and the time and space. So that brings us back to the fossil fuel gateway. Let's talk about the transformation of the Pacific Northwest into a fossil fuel gateway. What's going on? I'll start with coal. Coal is the more familiar part of this story. It's been going on for a number of years, and a lot of people here are probably active in this issue. Coal demand in the U.S. is declining, just as it is here in Oregon, where the major coal plants are being retired, one each in those two states. Coal, of course, is primarily used to generate electricity. Its share of the power market in the United States has declined from over 50% to under 40% just in the last 3 or 4 years. There's several reasons. One, as a result of years of litigation against the EPA, we're finally actually enforcing our environmental laws against the old coal plants that were exempted for over a generation. As the bill comes due for retrofitting those plants and cleaning them up, utilities are deciding in many cases it's not worth the price. Let's shut it down. That's being refortified and strengthened in large part by a citizen movement that's going after maximizing the retirements of the old coal plants as well as preventing the construction of any new ones. That large and well-organized citizens movement is having a huge impact and is having it's both citizen outreach and litigation that's taking place. It's creating an impetus for a better future that's not a coal future, of course. Natural gas prices are low, and that's helping with this transition, as are state laws that are mandating increased production of renewable sources of power and of investments in efficiency. But the U.S. has a lot of coal. As you all have heard, I'm sure, U.S. is the Saudi Arabia of coal. The coal is still in the ground, and there are a lot of companies whose future depends upon the mining and selling of that coal. Coal mainly moves by train from where it's mined to where it's burned. Moving coal has been the biggest moneymaker for years and years for the U.S. railroads. So the coal companies and the railroad companies are allied in this issue. The biggest coal deposits and the cheapest to mine by far are in the Wyoming and Montana Powder River Basin, nowhere near the ocean. If coal is declining in the United States, the obvious market that they are looking at is overseas, where there are developing economies still building new coal-burning power plants. So if you're in the Powder River Basin, how do you get your coal to Asia? The cheapest way to get your Powder River Basin coal to Asia is to build a rail line to a terminal in the Pacific Northwest and put it on a ship to Asia. But there are not any coal shipping terminals on the West Coast in the United States. There is one in Vancouver, BC. Developing new terminals is necessary for this strategy to work for the coal companies and the rail companies. And practically overnight, a few years ago, proposals for new coal terminals sprouted up in Washington and Oregon. There were 6 or 7 of them at the peak. They were on Puget Sound, they were on the Columbia River, and they were on the coast of the 2 states. Coal would be delivered in several mile-long coal trains per week, unloaded onto a huge pile on a wharf, loaded onto ships, and sent to Asia. In the beginning, there was next to no publicity about this. No meaningful environmental review by the government agencies that have the responsibility for issuing permission for these terminals to be developed. The first one out of the gates in terms of the development proposal was the Millennium Bulk Terminal in Longview, Washington, which is about 50 miles up north, downstream on the Columbia from here on the Washington side of the river. In 2010, the county government gave approval to the development of a terminal without any environmental review. The proposal was cast as a proposal for a 5 million ton per year terminal, coal handling facility. Earth Justice represented the Columbia River Keeper, Climate Solutions, the Sierra Club, and other groups appealed that permit. We learned in the documents that we got to look at because of the litigation that they actually were planning a 60 million ton per year terminal, 12-fold bigger than what they'd said they were planning. And their memo, actually, their internal memo, their smoking gun memo actually said, if we get the 5 million terminal approved, it'll be easy to expand. But if we ask for the 60 million ton, they might have a problem with it. So let's ask for the 5 and then just start expanding. So the company had to admit their deceit. They had to admit that they'd been trying to pass this off on both the public and on the regulatory agencies, and they withdrew their proposal. But they didn't go home altogether. They withdrew their proposal to go back to the drawing boards and do an actual full-blown environmental review of a new proposal, which is a 44 million ton per year proposal that's now being developed, not yet decided by any of the agencies. Second proposal that's still going on is up in northern state of Washington in Bellingham, the Gateway Pacific proposal in a place called Cherry Point. Very strongly supported. It's bigger than the Millennium Bulk proposal. It was a huge controversy that you may have followed in the 2013 elections, in which the local county commissioners who had supported the development of the terminal were turned out of office, and a new slate of anti-coal commissioners were elected. That's put a wrinkle in the plans for this one, but it still has a lot of momentum behind it. No permits there yet either, so again, not being litigated. The third that's still going on is on the Columbia, on the Oregon side of the river, upriver at the site of the Boardman Power Plant, where there's already a rail line to deliver coal. Oregon doesn't have as strong a state environmental review law as the state of Washington does, so there's not as much state oversight of the permitting process. The state of Oregon has issued 3 state permits for this facility. There's one still pending, and then there's a set of federal permits that are still pending. So the legal challenges to this one is just beginning. Taken together, these 3 terminals, if they were all built, would mean over 100 million tons of coal a year coming into the Pacific Northwest for shipment overseas. That's 8,000 coal trains, each a mile long, coming into the region, or over 40 per day. Most of them coming down the Columbia River Gorge because the coal trains are too heavy to go over the mountains, so they come down the Columbia River Gorge. All we're talking about right now is the potential impacts of coal development from the perspective of communities that the coal trains are passing through, the marine perspective of all the increased shipping and so forth. But the most important, of course, is the carbon impact of burning all this coal. It's a huge quantity of coal. Washington's one coal-burning power plant that's now slated for retirement is called the TransAlta plant. It burns 7 million tons of coal per year. So these exports would be the equivalent of 15 times that amount. That's like 15 new coal burning. If that was burned here, that'd be like we're saying we're going to build 15 new coal burning power plants. Instead, it's going to be burned somewhere else. And so the proponents of the project say, well, this is going to be burned somewhere anyway, so what's the problem? We're not making any difference. Similar arguments being made today about the Keystone Pipeline. Well, the answer to that is if you put this much more coal on the Asia market, that reduces the price. It keeps the incentives alive for burning coal in Asia instead of saying, let's keep our coal on the ground and let the price go up and increase the incentives for transitioning away from coal in Asia. So if you're interested in this coal issue, there are many ways to take action and participate if you're not already. The coalition of groups in the Northwest is called Power Pass Coal, and you can find them on the web. They are great about publicizing the actions that can be taken. A local group, the Columbia Riverkeeper, is also very involved, and Earth Justice is very involved. So the websites of any of those organizations, participating in them, supporting their work would be a great way to keep monitoring the process, know when to submit public comments, know when to attend public meetings, particularly getting the message to Governor Kitzhaber, because basically Governor Kitzhaber holds the reins on what the state of Oregon is going to do on the one that's the most likely to get approved, and that's the one at Morrow Pacific. That's coal. Let me turn to oil for a minute. This is a newer, less well-known, but a similar pattern story. So like coal, the oil reserves are in the middle of the continent, nowhere near the ocean. Most of the oil refineries are along the coasts. So we have the same problem of where do they get the oil to the refineries that it's going to be processed in, or you get it to a place to ship it overseas or to somewhere else. So the boom in U.S. oil production is primarily taking place in North Dakota, in an oil field called the Bakken. That's new. It's developed very, very rapidly in terms of increased production. And so it's not a place that already has an infrastructure of pipelines to get the oil from North Dakota out to the places that have refineries. Therefore, the thing that's happening is it's being put on trains. The refineries are mostly, as I said, mostly on the coast, on the Gulf Coast, on the West Coast, and the Great Lakes, and on the East Coast. On the West Coast, the refineries that have been built here, Puget Sound, Columbia River, San Francisco Bay, Los Angeles, they are mainly supplied with oil from Alaska. It comes down by ship from Alaska. The oil production in Alaska has been declining for years. It's much, much less than it used to be. And so these refineries are looking for more oil. Bringing it in by train from the Bakken is a bonanza for local refineries, and there's a lot of expansion going on in West Coast refineries to refine the oil that's coming from the Bakken. Similarly, more oil production is taking place in Alberta in the tar sands. It's a different kind of oil. It's hard to transport. It's hard to refine, but it has limited pipeline capacity. The Keystone Pipeline is the high-profile pipeline project to get tar sands oil to U.S. refineries. But there's an existing small pipeline from the tar sands region of Alberta down to Vancouver, BC, that has a proposal to expand it by 7 times. So we'll talk about that in a moment. But just to give you a sense of how fast this has happened, in 2008 there were 10,000 rail cars of oil delivered in the United States in the year. In 2013 there were 400,000 rail cars delivered of oil in the United States. That's a 40-fold increase in 5 years. The Bakken oil has a particularly dastardly feature, which is that it's very flammable. It's more like hauling gasoline than it is like hauling what you think of as crude oil. And so one thing that's happened rapidly with this increase in oil transportation is a rapid increase in explosions and oil spills. Most horribly in a small town in Quebec, Lac Mégantic, where 47 people died when a Bakken oil train going to an East Coast refinery derailed and exploded and burned down most of a downtown on a Saturday night. But there have been explosions in Alabama and in many other parts of the United States just in the last 18 months. Rail shipment of oil to existing refineries in the Pacific Northwest is expected to triple in this single year, 2014. The first shipment from North Dakota to a Northwest refinery was in 2012. Why is it coming here? Like I said, the West Coast refineries are hungry for more oil because the Alaska oil production is declining. So much of the oil that may come here by train will be refined here, and the products will be shipped out or used here. Much of the oil that's shipped here by train will be loaded onto ships to send to California refineries for use, refining and use in California. Sort of like in coal, sort of paralleling coal, there are 3 terminal projects to develop oil terminals on the coast. One in Grace Harbor, Washington, where there's been several rounds of successful litigation, but there's still a proposal pending there. Or Justice represents the Quinault Indian Nation there, this is their ancient traditional fishing grounds. They've got fishing rights. They're very concerned about the marine impacts of increased ship traffic and oil spills. A second in Vancouver on the Washington side of the Columbia River, the Tesoro Terminal. And third, that one's also being studied. And then third, on the Oregon side of the river, a place called Global Pacific, already operating. It was in a scenario that's happening in other places as well, including the Bay Area. It was an ethanol plant shut down, rail terminal, rail access to it, and it's been reopened to handle Bakken crude oil. That's also happening in other places. And I mentioned the pipeline just across the border. The Kinder Morgan Company wants to build a second pipeline from the tar sands to Vancouver, which would result in a 7-fold increase in oil ships using the straits, using Juan de Fuca Strait, Haro Strait, and the traditional fishing grounds of the tribes that use the waters up there. It would mean a loaded oil tanker through Indian fishing grounds every day of the week. And so that's tar sands crude, which is heavy. The belief is it sinks if it hits water. So instead of having, our oil spill cleanup technology is all about booms and scoops, getting the oil off the surface of the water. We don't know how to do anything about cleanup if the oil sinks. And that's what the expectation is the bitumen would do. We don't have big oil spill cleanup plans in place for the Columbia River. This is happening on the Hudson River too. The rail lines that go to Albany, there are oil terminals there. The oil is being put on barges to come down the Hudson River to the refineries in northern New Jersey. The Hudson River is not a place that's developed a lot of sophisticated oil spill response capacity. So this crisis almost is happening in many, many places. So in terms of this Canadian pipeline, we represent U.S. tribes who have an interest in those waters who are intervening in the legal process regarding approval of the Canadian pipeline in Canada. So the federal agencies and the state agencies that have responsibility for these projects, both coal and oil, they have a checklist they have to go through in doing the environmental review. There's certain things that have to be met, and if those things are met, they're compelled to issue the permits. That's their view of the world. Until now, until the citizen uproar that's been happening, their view of the world was it's a coal terminal. We're not doing anything here. We're just unloading it here and putting it on a ship and sending it there. So it's not like we were building the coal plant. We don't have any big review to do. They weren't looking at the climate impacts. They weren't looking at the coal train impacts going through these communities. So that's been changing as a result of some of the litigation and the citizen input. So 2 closing points when you think about the key role of citizens and of litigation in this fight here. First of all, I mentioned in the context of the Ancient Forest Campaign that the timber companies and their allies tried to take away the citizens' rights to go to court. That would have been taking the best arrow out of the quiver and breaking it over their knee. Well, that, not surprisingly, is another parallel to this story. The fossil fuel companies are very, very much working to take away citizens' rights to go to court. There are legislative proposals that we're fighting in Congress all the time to limit citizens' access to the courts to challenge polluter misconduct and to challenge agencies that aren't doing their jobs. There are also bills in Congress to limit what judges can do when they find a violation of the law, and we fight those. These environmental laws say that if a citizens group takes the government to court or a polluter to court and wins and proves the law has been violated, the loser, the violator, has to pay the expenses of the winner, so that citizens groups who don't have money can go to court. They're trying to take that away. This is an escalating battle in Congress, and there's some great champions on our side of this, and one of them is Senator Mosley. So if you have the chance, thank your good Senator Mosley for his work on protecting citizens' access to the courts. Merkley. These trends are also happening in the courts themselves. There are several of the Supreme Court justices have an agenda to limit citizens' rights to sue and to use the courts and limit what judges can do. So that is a big. That's not what you're thinking about when you're here in the Northwest thinking about an oil train or a coal terminal, but it's part of the background and a fight that you should be paying attention to. The second final point, is to return to the climate implications of the fossil fuel expansion. Most of you probably know leading scientists, the World Bank, the International Energy Agency, they've all determined that to prevent the devastating consequences of climate change, we need to leave most of these fossil fuels in the ground. We need to leave 75 to 80% of the fossil fuels in the ground if we're going to keep ourselves below 2 degrees centigrade of warming. Full stop. We've got to leave it in the ground. That means we have to fight the battles where the outcome can be not only we shift it from one place to another, but we actually result in leaving it in the ground. Our global path still is toward increased use of fossil fuels. But some cities in the world, some states in the world, some nations in the world are working hard to chart a new path, a new clean energy future. The Pacific Northwest has been in the vanguard of those efforts globally. These coal and oil projects, in my view, undermine that leadership and that progress. This is the crossroads that the region is at. Which future do you choose? Do you choose to be a global climate leader with rich natural resources and healthy communities, or do you choose to be a fossil fuel gateway with waterways full of tankers, air polluted by refinery emissions, coal and oil trains in every downtown, and a place which is supplying fossil energy to the world? I hope you will join us at Earth Justice, fighting against the fossil fuel gateway and for a clean energy future. Thank you. So, time for questions. Yes?
Trip, you didn't mention anything about natural gas liquefying plants that are proposed, specifically in Leedsport, Oregon. Care to comment on that?
Same story. So I'll repeat questions in case people don't hear the questions. The question was, I talked about coal, I talked about oil, I didn't talk about the third fossil fuel, natural gas, and there are export proposals which requires liquefaction which requires freezing the natural gas to put it on ships, and that is a very energy intensive process. The burning of the gas itself has a lower carbon output than burning coal, but everything else about gas production and gas transportation, when you add that into the mix, makes it basically equivalent to coal, and particularly if you ship it overseas as liquefied natural gas. We are debating in this country right now whether to allow exporting, how much exporting of natural gas to allow, and whether to start allowing the export of crude oil, because we're producing so much. And so there's a lot of impetus to expand the gas production and oil production by allowing exports. So the local battles over LNG facilities are just as crucial. What else?
Trip, thank you very much. My question is about how Earth Justice sees citizen engagement with the projects that you work on, and what the role is in terms of citizen participation in fossil fuel gateways and Earth Justice work.
So the question is, how does Earth Justice see citizen participation in the work that we do and in the decisions that are being made? So our work, the most fundamental thing about our work is it is about putting citizens into the decision-making process. So when information is being hidden, we use the Freedom of Information laws to get the information. When citizens are being precluded from participating in the process, we advocate for a process that does include public input. When the law makes that available but it's not happening, we go to court to insist on the availability of public input. So it's very fundamental, and what we're very aware of and always thinking about in terms of formulating what do we work on and how do we go about it and who are our allies is lawsuits by themselves don't do the job. Lawsuits may, as I was saying, create the opportunity for change to take place. They may change an agency's behavior, but for that to last, for that to mean anything, for that to actually be implemented, it has to be coupled with a political strategy, an organizing strategy. It has to be coupled with good science. It has to be coupled with, sort of all the pieces of the puzzle have to be in place for actual lasting results to be accomplished. And so one of the things that we do is think about what is the case about, really? Who's got something at stake here that will resonate with people? And think about who our clients and allies ought to be. Who should be the coalition to work on this issue? So I mentioned several times that we're representing tribes. We could, in those same cases, we could instead be representing a traditional environmental group. The tribes have a much more fundamental and I think widely publicly accepted stake, and so they're a more potent client in a way to achieve the outcome that we and they together want. In air pollution cases, we'll often represent the American Lung Association because they've got the credibility on air pollution impacts on people that surpasses what a traditional environmental group would have. So it's just very fundamental to how we work. Thank you. Over here, yeah.
Hi. I was wondering how you see grassroots resistance and direct actions like lockdowns at construction sites or monkey wrenching and that type of thing fitting into the picture of resisting these infrastructure expansions.
So I'll separate and answer this. So the question is, how do I see direct action civil disobedience, shut down the construction site, stand on the railroad track, whatever. Here I will do two things. One is I'll put on my Earth Justice. I've got my Earth Justice hat on. See my Earth Justice hat. I'm wearing my Earth Justice hat. And in that capacity, we are law enforcers. We go to court to enforce the law. We are officers of the court, and we have to be, we're saying the problem here, Judge, is they're breaking the law. That company's breaking the law. That agency's breaking the law. To do that, we have to not be the lawbreakers ourselves. So as an organization, as litigators seeking to enforce the law, we're not participating in civil disobedience. Personally, and as a political strategist, I'm happy for people to be engaging in productive civil disobedience, and I personally recognize it has a huge role to play in social change movements. So that's when I took my Earth Justice hat off to say that. So, depending on the questions, I may do that again. So. What else? Yeah.
Hello again.
Oh, up here, and then back here.
So you mentioned so Freedom of Information Act and getting people to be engaged in these cases is one thing, but what have you seen both, I guess, sort of in modern day, but also in historical context, the barriers to civic participation being? Are there sort of active forces that you see at play, or are there also more sort of daily factors that prevent people from getting involved in representing their communities in these cases?
So the question is, what are the barriers to citizen participation? Mm-hmm. There may be different categories. There may be deliberate. There may be sort of thoughtless. There may be kind of customs. What is it? Is there problems with the law? So there's a lot of different things. There are sometimes deliberate. I think many of the ways that the coal and oil terminal permit applications have been handled in the Pacific Northwest and elsewhere right now is we want to get this done quick before anybody finds out. Because once people find out, there's going to be a lot more scrutiny, public hearings, debate, so forth, slow us down. If we can get it permitted, much better. So there's sometimes deliberate to keep it really quiet. I think there's also a lot of sort of business practice as usual, which disempowers people from participation, and that includes things like, well, the meetings take place during the workday. So unless it's your job to go to these environmental meetings, you can't go because you've got another job. And volunteers have a harder time doing this than when the meeting is scheduled on an evening or a weekend time. Or the meeting is in a place that's not particularly connected to a community that's affected by the decision being made. It's in the state capitol, and the decision is actually affecting a community far from the state capitol. Or there's a language issue, or sort of language and customs issues about how are you communicating that information to people, and how are you taking their input back? Does everybody have to have an email account and send in their comments online and have to know how to do all that? Or is there some other mechanism made available? So there's everything on the spectrum from lack of affirmative steps to outreach to deliberate attempts to silence. We were here first. Sorry. Right here in the green shirt.
So as we shut down these coal plants, how do you see, in what way will this be seminal to Oregon and Washington's future energy infrastructure? So, in what way are we going to satisfy our energy needs, and what does that look like?
So how's Oregon going to satisfy its energy needs? There's a process going on right now. So the one big coal plant in Oregon got an announced retirement date with a planning period to, okay, what are we going to do what's that company going to do with that plant, the Boardman plant? That's going on. Some of you are involved. The state, meanwhile, is looking at overall mix of energy resources and what's policies to stimulate further development of renewables and efficiency investments. We're finding the more of that we do, the more we find that it works. So there's an accelerating momentum about deploying renewables. We're at the very beginning stages of developing the storage technology, which is needed to take the renewables many, many steps further. Storage meaning renewables are producing when the wind is blowing or the sun is shining and not otherwise. So the better we can do at storing that energy and using it when we need it and leveling out the demand the better we'll do with clean energy. So, and I think part of my concern about the fossil fuel gateway is when you've gone to all the trouble to ship stuff here, there's going to be pressure to use it here, right? Maybe it's hard today to build a new coal plant in Oregon, no question. But if this becomes a fossil fuel gateway, will it continue to be that hard when the coal is available here? Will that still be the case? There will clearly be pressure to expand the refineries, which is not so much an electric power question, it's more of a vehicle transportation question. So, I think it's a countervailing pressure. Either we keep pushing toward the clean and to constrain the fossil fuel development, or we let this happen and then it's going to have the momentum. Yeah. Well, I think there was one back here and then back to Tony.
What can be done to stop facilities that are built with renewable energy subsidies from being re-permitted to handle fossil fuels? Oh,
good question. Question is, what can be done to prevent facilities that are permitted to develop, to be running on renewable energy, to being re-permitted or retrofitted to burn fossil fuels? I don't know how to give a general answer on that. I think there's a definite, watchdog, get involved, attack them at every stage answer to that. But I don't think there's a generic answer to that. I think it's the kind of thing that will tend to happen without the very strong, intensive citizen participation. So I encourage you to keep at it. But I don't have a good. So it'd be really a case-specific answer as to how do you actually enforce it, depending on what the commitments were, what kind of facility is it, et cetera. So, right here.
Could you speak to the role of Earth Justice and the environmental movement in engaging communities of color and low-income communities in fights like this, coal and other fights?
Sure. The question is, can I speak to the role of Earth Justice in engaging communities of color and low-income communities in these kinds of fights? Earth Justice is called Earth Justice for a reason. It's the marriage of earth and justice on purpose. And we want, as was true in when we were talking about the citizen participation question, we exist in part to strengthen the role of people who have been whose voices have not been heard and who have been underrepresented in these fights to clean up their communities. And so we take on work to protect farm workers from pesticides and take the most toxic pesticides off the market, which the EPA has done a really poor job of. And we've got a whole suite of cases about reducing toxic exposures to farm workers from pesticides. We're working on oil refineries and coal plants, in part because of the climate reasons that we're talking about, and in part because of the human health reasons in the communities where we're there. And we're reaching out to there's been I guess I'd say if you look back 5 years, there's maybe a paradigm was Earth Justice representing Sierra Club suing the EPA to get a better rule to control air emissions from a coal plant. Actually, we did that for 15 years, and it was a great success. But a lot of times when it's something not quite as important so much in the public eye as coal-burning power plants, when it's steel mills or incinerators, there's not the follow-through of groups motivated to work on this issue and carry out not just a court victory, but to make sure the standards actually get set in a healthy way. So we're doing more to enlist groups that are in the neighborhoods that are affected by the types of pollution that we're working on, whether it's incinerators or steel mills or cement kilns or power plants. And that means helping build networks, and that means having a whole different way of going about how we work with clients, how the clients are engaged in the national regulatory process. So it means helping them be engaged in a national process that's happening in DC that they were probably not aware of. And it means having us be more aware of the fights as they happen locally, which we weren't all that aware of. And so we're working on a problem. We don't necessarily know a lot about it. And they're suffering a problem, and they don't really have an idea how it's being dealt with in Washington. And this is to make that connection happen. Thank you. Yes?
A little while ago, you suggested that Governor Kitzhaber was a key person with regard to terminating these exports in the state of Oregon. What can the citizens of Oregon do to get him to move off the dime and do something? I mean, this whole argument could be settled tomorrow if he were to do the correct thing.
Yeah. Basically hound him. Give him no mercy is what I would basically say. In other words, be present at every meeting, ask this question all the time. I'll give you the example of what's happening with President Obama and the Keystone Pipeline, which is everywhere he goes, people are people are in the street saying this is what we want. So he's at a fundraiser in San Francisco, or he's at a school in Philadelphia, and there's people there saying, by the way, whatever else you're thinking about today, Mr. President, you got to think about this, and you got to think about it long and hard. It's that kind of constant pressure, being involved in getting the message to others, following knowing when the public comments and public hearings are, so you can actually get your participation at the right time in the right way. Hooking up with the groups that are really doing the in-depth advocacy, some of which I named, the ones I named before, Power Plus Coal, Columbia Riverkeeper, Sierra Club, Earth Justice. So that's it. Yes?
How much flexibility does the governor have in denying these permits? How much is he constrained by Oregon law to follow the process?
The governor, of course, has to follow the law. The agencies are following the law. The governor and the agencies have a lot of leeway under the law as to how hard they look at these questions, how much information they ask for, how close a scrutiny do they give it, how much public participation do they allow for, and so forth. So it's not, the law won't, then there's the possibility of changing the law. The governor could say, we haven't been prepared for this. Our laws aren't prepared for this. Let's go write a more comprehensive set of regulations about what we're actually going to look at when we're evaluating a coal terminal. Are we going to consider the climate impacts globally? No, the law doesn't say you must do that today, but that's part of the argument that's being made. Oregon, as a responsible climate leader, should be considering that in this debate. You'd have to change the law to do that. Perfectly fine to change the law to do that, but it's not going to be written into it today. So, that kind of follow the existing law and look at what you need to do to change the law. And the governor's got, allies in the legislature, and he's in charge of the regulatory process at the agencies, and there's room to do that. What else?
I have one more question. This is sort of on the international level. So I'm concerned with the Trans-Pacific Partnership Alliance and the possibility for increased international law that makes it more difficult for citizens and national or state level groups to take control of what they believe to be within and without the law. What do you think of the Trans-Pacific Partnership Alliance, or more generally international regulation and tribunes?
So the question is the international trade agreement between around the Pacific countries, which includes the U.S. and many Asian countries, right? That's being negotiated right now. What do I think of that? With the problem pointed out being it has the potential to weaken environmental standards in countries under international global trade laws. So I guess I'll say a couple things about this. One is there's a similar process going on in the Atlantic, the U.S. and Europe, and there are perils in both. The perils in international trade agreements are they generally give a foreign investor rights to undermine the domestic environmental or other health and safety protections of the host country of the investment. So in the United States, under NAFTA, a Canadian mining company sued the state of California saying, your mining laws are undermining our investment expectations in the mine we were investing in California. And California is big enough and committed enough to its mining laws to fight back, and did so successfully. But when it's Canadian mining company or U.S. mining company and Ecuador or Philippines, they may say, we are going to weaken our law. We're not going to enforce our law against your mine and impair your investment. So it has this direct effect of undermining laws and it creates a race to the bottom on the laws instead of a lifting. So we're concerned about both. We're actually, I would say, as concerned about the Atlantic as the Pacific, because U.S. companies will use an Atlantic agreement to weaken European standards more powerfully than Asian companies would use to weaken U.S. standards. So U.S. standards are stronger generally than Asian standards. So there is the possibility of a weakening through the Pacific Agreement, but I think there's actually, in terms of raising the bar, I think the bigger risk is in the Atlantic, where U.S. companies will try to weaken Europe's stronger standards than we have. And so This goes back to World Trade Organization, and it goes back to NAFTA. It's a long-running problem with our global trade agreements. We're not going to fix all that in these negotiations. It's something where we've long fought for greater citizen participation rights, greater public disclosure of what's going on. These disputes are usually resolved under the trade agreements in private and confidential arbitrations rather than in a proceeding that the public can be a part of. So we've done some cases where we got the arbitrator to agree that a non-party, but an interested party, could participate through an amicus brief, basically get the views of others who had something at stake into the process. But we haven't been able to change the agreements themselves. Long answer. One more up here? No? Anything else? Over here? Okay. I think you're right about the much higher hazard of the oil trains, and I think in terms of the effects of there's the explosion, which is not really going to happen with a coal train, and then there's the spill, which would be more harmful than a coal train spill. And there's part of what's happened in this oil train issue happened so fast is it gets into the railroad safety regulations and the design of the rail cars and the readiness of the rail infrastructure to handle this traffic. And so those are arenas in which we don't normally operate. It's not unusual for us to find our work taking us into some new arena, but we are looking at, are there cases that we should get involved in that have to do with those safety issues that would be worth doing? In other words, from what the outcome would be, would they make a difference enough in terms of the interest that we're pursuing, and like the likelihood of these trains coming into these communities, or notice to these communities or their ability to plan? Would we get involved in that? So we're having those discussions as we're exploring how this issue branches out into some topics that we've never been involved in. And that happens often. It's wonderful. Wonderful aspect of our work is there's something new every day to start to try to figure out. One back here and then back here.
All right. I would like it if you would expand as you like on a sticky mess that we have here in Portland. We have a super fund in the river basin that involves lots of companies, some of which aren't even existing anymore.
Yeah.
And there's this question of cleanup, and depending on how many nines of purity you're pursuing in the cleanup, we're talking about the GDP of the city, county, state, or nation. So it's kind of a sticky problem. How clean do we decide to get things? Do we just go for hotspots? When you have a mess as big as this, how would Earth Justice try to wade into that matter?
Well, we haven't. It is a really tough set of problems, and that are faced in many places. We've tended not to get involved in the how many nines at the site-specific level because we could have our whole Seattle office spend all their time on that, and it's sort of like you're saying about the economic cost. It would be the same in terms of the person power of our limited resources, and so we haven't. It's conceivable that because of a particular place, particular setting, or particular level, how hot are the hot spots kind of thing, and how badly are they being ignored, it's possible we would get involved. But I certainly would. I don't have any background on those choices as they are facing the Willamette and this region. So they're very complicated. Yeah, thank you.
So when you were talking about the shipping of tar sands and other fossil fuels to the Northwest, I was thinking, what kind of resources would be shipped back? Because clearly they're not going to just ship a material to the Pacific Northwest and ship back empty trains. So would this possibly be conducive to increased logging in the Pacific Northwest? Because when I think of the natural resources up here, I think of salmon, timber, and coal, and we sure as hell aren't going to be shipping salmon to the,
In oil cars, I hope.
Yeah, so one would hope, but so, what are the consequences that we might see from the resource extraction that will be, going to the middle of the country?
I don't have an answer to what might come back either in the ships to the Northwest or might be sent back in the trains that leave the Northwest. Those are pretty specialized rail cars, both for coal and oil. I don't see them being used for food for sure, and even timber. I mean, it's just a different car, and this is taking up a huge amount of the rail capacity. So what's happening is passenger rails and other freight is being delayed by the congestion in the system of these mile-long coal trains and mile-long oil trains. So it may actually mean other things are getting squeezed off the rail system as opposed to it actually being more available to the rail system. Because I don't know what's going to come back in empties. You're out beyond my technical knowledge. If the oil's coming to the refineries and being refined, can the refined products go back in the same car? Send it back with gasoline, other chemicals. I don't know the answer to that.
Chip, can you talk a little bit about your coordination and perhaps conflicts with other environmental groups as you plan strategy for coal? I specifically think of the Sierra Club, which has its own coal strategy. How much do you coordinate with other large environmental groups, and what kind of conflicts arise in that coordination?
So the question is, how much do we coordinate with other large environmental groups in general, and what kind of conflicts can arise, and then specifically, what about the Sierra Club and the Beyond Coal campaign? Let me start with the Sierra Club and the Beyond Coal campaign. We're huge. We're like all in with the Sierra Club on the Beyond Coal campaign. We do dozens and dozens of coal cases representing the Sierra Club and other organizations. And many other organizations, legal and not, are involved in that campaign and in terms of the litigation work that's happening in basically every state that has coal. It's a more elaborate and well-coordinated litigation effort than I've seen on anything else. So we're very involved. As is the case in any kind of litigation representing multiple parties, there's always the possibility of divergence of interests. So in a coal case, for example, we can start off representing a coalition, and this will be true in any case where we're representing multiple clients. We have duties of loyalty to every client that can't favor one client over another. We have to zealously represent the interests of all the clients. So we have to work really hard at the beginning to do all we can do to make sure we're on the same page about the goals of the case, and what are we going to do when this hard decision and that hard decision that we can foresee have to be made. Are we going to be in the same place then? Because if they disagree, fundamentally disagree, and don't come to an agreement, we could be excluded from representing anybody in that case. They each have to go get their own lawyers, and we're out of it. And we've just spent thousands of hours and something we really care about, and now we're disqualified from doing anything. We don't like that. The clients don't like that. We want to avoid that, so we work really hard up front. In a coal plant case, as an example of the kind of conflict that can develop, the groups come in with different purposes. The paradigm might be the national group is interested in shutting down the coal plant or shutting down pieces of the coal plant and less concerned about what's happening in the community. where some units of the coal plant may continue to operate on some cleanup plan or something like that. Local groups involved who are vital players in the group may be more focused on what do we get from the cleanup of the plant and less focused on how many megawatts are shut down. So our goal is to sort out that issue before we start and not have it fall apart at the end. And sometimes in the resolution or settlement of a case where an offer is on the table and it's the last best offer you're going to get, and you're uncertain about your litigation prospects, and it's going to be, we're going to shut down A, B, and C, and we're going to clean up D, E, and F, and some clients say that's great, we're going to declare victory and save the rest for another day, and others say this is a disaster, and they can't work that out, that's terrible. So in a generic sense, I can say things like that have happened. And in a generic sense, I can say things like that will happen again. So we're very frequently in the context of working through issues with diverse coalitions, big groups, small groups, groups with different interests, and that's just a critical part of the work. We are also working all the time in various combinations with other national environmental groups. We coordinate a lot on federal lobbying and federal sort of policy making stuff. Earth Justice represents any group you can think of that ever goes to court, basically, in court. And so to do that, we have good working relationships, kind of relationships of trust and respect with all these groups that use our legal services for free. And they know we're trying to stay in that specialist niche of doing the litigation rather than saying, oh, we do it all. And so we're not competing in the sense of, oh, we're all trying to say we're the best lobbyists in the world, or we're all trying to say we've got the best grassroots organizing in the world, or whatever. We're just trying to say we got really good litigation, and use us when you want to use us, and otherwise we respect your expertise. So conflicts develop, in any big, messy policy-making thing, and climate is the biggest and the messiest. So they've certainly been policy differences among, for example, environmental justice groups and cap-and-trade proponents. That was a big public disagreement that's not all over. So that, I'm not sure I'm not sure whether to keep going with that kind of possibilities, or whether you want to. There's more you want to ask about that? Okay, thanks. Anything else? And here's somebody who hasn't spoken.
Would you say that the tribes in general are more assertive of some of their rights than in the recent past? And in some cases where tribes have a traditional conflict with each other, kind of burden themselves from looking at the broader picture of tribes in general?
So there's a general question about tribes in general, about how tribes are they more assertive of their rights in these kinds of issues, I guess, these days than in the past, and what about conflicts between tribes? Politics between and within tribes are very complex, and it's very complex for a non-tribal member to step into any role in relation to those politics. We work alongside of and as an ally of tribes in many circumstances, particularly in the Northwest. It's been about salmon restoration, marine protection. In other places, it's other things. And there are times when we're in other parts of the country, we're on the opposite side of a case from a tribe. Tribe wants to develop, in Montana wants to develop its coal resources. We might be on the opposite side of that case. Or in the Southwest, on some of these coal plant and coal mining issues, the tribe has officially approved a new coal burning power plant, and a environmentally oriented group of tribal members within the tribe wants to fight that. And we might work with them, but that's obviously perilous to do because we have to be invited in and have to be understanding what that role is. So I think that at least I'm seeing quite a lot of tribal engagement on this fossil fuel gateway set of issues, because it is such a huge threat to the tribal fishing culture and sustainability of those resources. And that's been a really wonderful development.
One strategy for dealing with carbon or anything we don't want is to tax it.
Yeah.
And the concept of a revenue-neutral carbon tax is being proposed, in which carbon would be taxed at the point of import into the country or extraction from the mine, and then the revenue from that tax would be distributed to everyone as part of their income tax refund. What does Earth Justice think about that concept, and what are the legal obstacles to passing that and implementing it?
So the question is, what about a carbon tax as an effective policy mechanism to reduce carbon emissions, and in particular, what about the policy proposal that's been, got a lot of traction of a revenue-neutral one where everybody gets money back on a tax return or something like that. So there's a lot of pieces to the answer to that. The first one is, going back to the Earth Justice doesn't do everything answer from before, we're in the climate legislative design question, we focus on a few things that we know something about, which is, how do you make this enforceable, whatever the design is? How do you make it so that the information is available to the public and the public can see what's happening, and whether it can evaluate, independent of the agencies or the companies, can evaluate whether carbon reductions are actually happening and can enforce the deals that have been made and the commitments that have been made if they're not actually happening. So in the whole cap-and-trade Waxman-Markey bill, we took no position on is that a good mechanism, but we got real involved in the legislative language about who's going to get to go to court to enforce this and what kind of information is going to be available. So that answer, that's the preface to, we don't have an official position on a carbon tax or on cap-and-trade or on 5 other mechanisms that might be designed to reduce carbon emissions. I think that just as a non-economist and my personal view would be, if we could get what we wanted politically, a tax would not be sufficient, because a tax doesn't guarantee how much carbon you're going to get reduced. It adjusts. You can adjust it and adjust it, but we need a cap and a price. We need to know we're going to reduce it to a certain level, and you can have like a really high tax on cigarettes, but we have a lot of people smoking cigarettes. So you can have a really high tax on carbon and we still use it. We just still won't give up our cars. So we don't know in other words, it doesn't guarantee an outcome. A cap, if you really could design a cap and you could, march the cap down, you could get the reductions that you wanted. That's not politically possible. So the tax and redistribute possibility is more politically palatable, but and it would be much better than anything we've got today, but it's not a complete answer, because you don't know you're going to get the reductions you need. Is it going to remain politically palatable if you're at $100 a ton or something? If you're at a really high price. So that's my non-economist's, non-Earth Justice position hat on at the moment. Maybe one more up there.
Would you talk about any new law or dramatic change in legislation? I had a feeling this is not the only time of rear guard action. I'm thankful for legislation that's 30 years old. I'm fearful that it could be wiped away because there's not support except for smart attorneys such as yourself in being able to defend that which was passed 30 years ago. So can you speak positively about initiatives for that which is even better than what we have now?
The question is, are there any positive legislative initiatives to point to, given that what we're talking about are laws that are 30 and 40 years old? Let me say, first of all, I was talking about the laws being in jeopardy. They're being under attack to be weakened, but they've not been weakened by and large. So in other words, there's strong public support for environmental laws that we have, and in the gridlock, in the mess of gridlock that we have in the Congress, gridlock has been our friend on ability to stop weakening of the laws. So that's worth remembering, that the fact that we've got a dysfunctional Congress isn't all bad sometimes. Or we would have lost a lot of environmental law in the Bush administration. They had Republican president and Republican House and Senate, and they would have, if there wasn't a filibuster possibility and there wasn't strong American public support for clean air and clean water and protecting wildlife, we would have lost some of those laws then. It didn't happen. In terms of initiatives, there's interesting climate law at the state level that's trying to create models for the federal level. So there's that in this climate arena we're mostly talking about. There's the possibility, still remote but possible, in terms of what federal legislative initiative in the environment has any chance at all? I guess I'd ask the question that way. The answer is reform of how we regulate toxic substances in products, toxic chemicals in carpet, in drywall, in paint, in Mr. Clean under your kitchen sink, all this stuff it's basically companies put whatever they want in there. There's no labeling, there's no testing, nothing. And that's not the case in much of the world. So we got better, the global companies are saying, God, we can't sell our products anymore in Europe. We can't sell our products anymore in Japan unless we clean up our act and test our chemicals and demonstrate that they're not harming people and disclose what they are at least to the regulators and submit the medical evidence and all that stuff that they don't have to do in the United States. If you're not eating it, they don't have to do that in the United States. So there's a bipartisan and industry and environmental recognition of we've got our most broken environmental laws, what's called the Toxic Substances Control Act, which is what's supposed to deal with this problem and doesn't. And there's a 400 organization national coalition trying to bring about progressive change on that issue. All kinds of groups, nurses, teachers, consumers, environmental groups, scientists, faith groups, market campaigns, political campaigns. It's been effective. It's gotten a lot of traction. It's got, as I say, it's got some bipartisan recognition, and it's got the industry kind of recognizing we can't keep going like we're going, or we're not going to be able to sell our European companies aren't going to want to sell their products here, and we can't sell our products there. So there's that kind of coming together of a possibility for change. We need it badly. The bill that's in the Senate today is not good enough. Even it wouldn't pass the House today, so I'm not saying this is about to happen, but it's the thing that's got more legs than anything related to public land management or wildlife or climate or energy or anything like that in the U.S. Congress. Yeah. Okay, thank you all. Great to be here.